Some of this material overlaps a bit with Professor Higgs' lecture that some of you just heard on the FDA and quality assurance and that kind of thing. So I apologize in advance for any overlap, but I've learned from teaching for some years that students usually benefit from hearing things twice. So if there is some overlap, I hope you'll excuse me. I'm shocked when I get my senior undergraduate students and I have to remind them of the concept of opportunity cost and that kind of thing. So it's very distressing and demoralizing to a professor to realize that something you taught 3 years ago has a half-life of about 3 weeks at most. And anyway, what I'd like to talk with you about today is health economics. I had an interest in health economics from pretty much the very beginning of my study of economics as an undergraduate. And this is because my father was a physician, and he was active in a group called the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, or AAPS, which is a great free market physicians organization. And they've been around for a long time doing some really good work. Counter to the far more statist AMA. So if you're interested in some resources by physicians for physicians on issues such as those I'm talking about today, the AAPS website is great, and I've got some material in here in which I quote from them. I'd like to do this in two parts. The first is on pharmaceuticals and profits and regulation. I would like to just mention as a kind of a preface here Bob Higgs' book that he edited called Hazardous to Our Health, FDA Regulation of Healthcare Products. Excellent resource on this material, and I'm sure that there's a lot that I would say that I would agree with from that book. Drug companies in the United States and elsewhere enjoy government-granted privileges. They have patent protection. They have the FDA protection against competitors. There are barriers to entry. We'll talk about some of those. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that it costs to bring a new drug to market. And who does this benefit but those who already have a drug treating the same kind of illness that's already in the market. Then there are these ordinary corporate protections. We've unfortunately gotten used to some of these things. And that tends to keep competitors out of the market as well, and also limit the degree to which pharmaceutical companies can be disciplined by the market for failure to do what consumers want. So if you listen to the lecture by Ronald Hamowy earlier this week, I think that was on Tuesday, the audio of that is already online. He did some great work on the Canadian Medicare type system that they have, and I'll refer to that again later. But Canada and some other countries have a kind of a monopsony system in which the government is the only buyer, effectively, of drugs. So what are the effects of this? Miller, Benjamin, and North, in a book called The Economics of Public Issues, a neat little book with a number of short treatments of various economic issues, they say that a single government agency in each country acts as a monopsony buyer of healthcare services on behalf of everyone. Individuals are either prevented from buying healthcare on their own or limited by government rules as to what they may buy. Like other monopsonies, the national health insurance systems force down the prices of the goods they buy, such as drugs, medical devices, and physicians' and nurses' services. This, in turn, reduces the quantities of those goods and services that suppliers will provide, particularly in the long run. The bad news, at least if you are a consumer of healthcare services, is that less healthcare is provided. Let's talk a little bit about advertising. Advertising for an approved drug for a newly discovered use violates FDA rules. I'm not even talking about advertising a new drug, which already has its own hurdles to jump over, but we're talking about a drug that's already been on the market for some other purpose, And the purveyors of this drug think, well, maybe there's something else that this drug can do that we hadn't initially gotten FDA approval for. Well, you're violating FDA rules if you take this old drug and you advertise a new use for it without getting the FDA approval. And some companies are simply not going to find it economically advantageous to revisit that approval process for each new use. And if you don't think that drugs have multiple uses, you're mistaken. Take a look at aspirin, which I will use later as an example of this. The new use, whatever that is, might be relatively unknown if it's not advertised. Advertising is a provision of information to consumers about the possible uses of a product. New drugs, according to Tom DiLorenzo, do consumers no good if they do not know about them. Advertising restrictions imposed by the FDA, therefore, prop up the profits of incumbent drug marketers at the expense of newcomers in the industry and at the expense of consumers. So the FDA is essentially working on behalf of the existing pharmaceutical companies in a way that prevents innovation, prevents things that will come along, that could come along, that would benefit consumers. And the United States has a relatively free situation in this regard. Other countries are even more restrictive. Canada would be a good example of this. What about aspirin? Well, I mentioned this earlier, but in 1988, at a meeting in the offices of the FDA commissioner, companies making aspirin were told that they could not advertise the benefits of aspirin in reducing the risk of a first heart attack. If they did, they were told explicitly that the FDA would bring legal action. So as a consequence, there was a long-term ban on advertising aspirin for prevention of heart attacks, which, because of the absence of that information on the part of consumers, led to tens of thousands of needless deaths per year. This is from Thomas Sowell in his book Applied Economics, quoting Paul Rubin, and you can take a look at the presentation when it's posted later and look up some of these references. The FDA is well known for testing drugs and testing foods and making sure, supposedly, that they are safe for consumers, but they can make two types of errors when they do this testing. They can first reject a drug that has benefits greater than the costs. That's called a type 1 error. Or they can accept a drug that has costs greater than the benefits. That's a type 2 error. And what's happened with the FDA is that they have put an inordinate amount of attention on trying to reduce those type 2 errors. The matrix here shows the two possibilities, the state of the world: either the benefits of the new drug exceed the costs, or the costs exceed the benefits. The FDA can then accept or reject the drug. There's no negative effect if the benefits exceed the costs and the FDA passed the drug. I will add a little caveat there that getting the drug accepted by the FDA did probably cost some hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases possibly more, and that itself has a detrimental effect, as we'll see. But if they end up accepting a drug that doesn't have a negative effect, then we can say, well, apart from the cost of getting the regulation, jumping the hurdles of the regulation, at least we wound up with the drug on the market. There's also no negative effect if a drug which had costs greater than benefits is kept off the market. Now, how do we know if the costs exceed the benefits? I would argue that the market is exceedingly good at trying to sort out which drugs have costs that exceed benefits and which ones have benefits that exceed costs. I would not say that just because you discover that a drug has some negative side effects, that this means that the drug should not be on the market. Typically, people don't like to put things into their bodies that do them some net harm. And I'll point out in my talk later today on consumer product safety, there's an article in the fall 2010 issue of the Independent Review on food safety regulation that makes a good point about how good the market is at sorting these kinds of things out. But there are two types of errors, as I said, one where the FDA accepts a drug where the costs exceed the benefits, and one where they reject a drug where the benefits exceed the cost. And this is just from the conventional understanding of what the FDA is supposed to be doing according to the mainstream view of regulation. But they cannot even meet the standard of their own, of the mainstream view of what regulation ought to be doing. The consensus in the economics literature, and this is just mainstream economics literature, suggests that the FDA has placed too great of an emphasis on type 2 errors. So they're trying to avoid the problem of admitting a drug to the market that later indicates some kind of major side effect. The FDA will tote out their ban of thalidomide as an example of the kind of thing that the FDA is supposed to be doing, and look how great we are, we banned thalidomide and Europeans allowed it, and we prevented all these birth defects. Now, most of you are too young to remember what thalidomide was or to have read about it even, and it's a drug that was given for morning sickness in pregnant women, and it turned out to cause birth defects, severe birth defects. And the FDA says, well, see, this is why we're here. We're here to keep people from consuming things that are bad for them. Well, that's what, to use the term from Bastiat, that's what's seen. What is unseen are the type 1 errors where they fail to approve or delay the approval of a beneficial new drug. So in the process of trying to do all of this testing and evaluation in clinical trials and so forth to try to keep a drug off the market that has side effects that are too severe in the judgment of the FDA, they are delaying, inevitably, drugs that would have a positive effect. One political factor, according to Viscusi, Harrington, and Vernon, is that the victims of those type 2 errors are more readily identifiable. You can say, well, here are the pictures of the victims who had the birth defects because of the drug that caused them. All right. So the people who die or suffer because of a drug not being admitted to the market are much more difficult to identify. Now, when AIDS came onto the scene, and AIDS victims said, well, we have, for what we know about AIDS, we have a death sentence on our heads. This is a fatal disease. You might as well let us try a drug to combat AIDS. And while you're sitting there testing this over 8 or 10 years, many of us are going to die. Why not let us at least give it a shot? And so this led to an improvement, at least, in the speed with which the FDA would approve certain drugs, a kind of a fast track. But it by no means permeated the FDA's policy on these things, and the FDA still produces enormous delays. The FDA is under this kind of inevitable political pressure